Have you ever stopped to think that a 19th century war cry echo in the voice of a child these days? Imagine a 6-year-old girl repeating words that not even history books can describe with such intensity. This is a narrative that will shake your convictions about time, memory, and secrets our country keeps in the shadows of the past. In the heart of Guanajuato, where the streets of stone tell stories in every curve and the bells of the colonial churches mark the hours as centuries, an ordinary family had been about to live something that would challenge all logic. It was September, the month when the air fills the perfume of the bougainvilleas and the Mexican flags flutter in the squares, as if the wind itself whispered memories of a heroic era. That morning, while the sun illuminated Rosa's stone house, typical of the region, Dona Carmen prepared its traditional Jamaica water in the kitchen. Her husband, Don Miguel, a mechanic of the historic center, reviewed some documents at the table, distracted by the sounds of a documentary about the independence that passed on television. Everything seemed normal, like any other day in Herrera's lives. His daughter, Valeria, played in the backyard with his dolls, his brown eyes shining in the light that filtered through the leaves of the orange tree planted by the great-grandfather decades ago. An ordinary, laughing child who loved to draw princesses and sing the songs learned at school. But that day would not be like the others. Suddenly, while the program showed the recreation of Dolores Scream, Valeria dropped her dolls. His little hands began to tremble, and his face took an expression that did not match a 6-year-old girl. "These bells," murmured with a voice too serious for his size. "I know these bells." Dona Carmen, wiping her hands on the embroidered apron she had inherited from her mother, approached worried. "What is it, my love?" Valeria got up slowly, as if she carried an invisible burden on her shoulders. "Dolores bells, Mom. When they played that night, I was there. I was ready to march." Carmen's heart almost stopped. The daughter had said, "I was ready," as if she were a man recalling a lived battle. "Valor, what are you talking about?" But the girl didn't seem to be there anymore. His eyes fixed a distant point, as if they saw scenes from another time, somewhere. "Father Hidalgo had a flag," he continued, with a voice that would jerk the pimple. "A flag with the brunette virgin. And when he lifted her, we all shouted, 'Live Mexico!'" The words came out with a conviction that had no explanation. Don Miguel, who hitherto watched from afar, dropped the papers and approached, feeling a shiver through his body. "Where did you hear this, daughter?" Vailwood looked at him with a look that seemed to have seen wars, pain, and glory. "I didn't hear, Dad. I lived. I was there when it all started." A heavy silence took over the yard. Only the distant noise of the cars was heard in the streets of Pedra and the tinnitus of the abages in the orange flowers. But something had changed forever in the Herrera family. That September morning, without realizing it, they had crossed the border between the possible and the impossible, between the present and a past that refused to be forgotten. And that was just the beginning of a story that would test everything they knew about Mexico, their heroes, and the mysteries that inhabit the memory of the soul. In the following days, the life of the Herrera became a whirlwind of doubts and amazement. Valeria was no longer the same girl who ran barefoot through the stone corridors, chasing the cat between the vessels of geraniums. Now he spent hours sitting in the backyard, drawing with colorful chalk on the clay tiles. But they were not childish drawings. There were no castles, flowers, or houses with steaming chimneys. His hands traced men with a wide laugh marching in formation, horses galloping between clouds of dust and elongated shapes that resembled muskets and spears. In the center of each drawing, always the same image, a wave flag with the figure of a dark woman. "Look, Mom," said one afternoon, pointing to the downstairs after the rain. "Here are the insurgents, and here the realists. We had less weapons, but much more courage." Dona Carmen knelt next to her daughter, watching those who looked like battle maps made by someone who was there. "You are the insurgents, my angel?" "We are us," said Valeria, as if it were obvious. "Those who fought for Mexico, who followed Father Hidalgo and Captain Allende." A chill traveled Carmen's column. In their family, women have always had a special sensitivity to things others did not realize. Her grandmother was healed in a village near Leon, and she herself was born with a keen intuition for the mysteries of the world. Now, seeing her daughter outline military strategies on the floor, I knew that something deep was happening. That afternoon, while preparing a mole pole in the kitchen of blue tiles, he heard Valeria in the backyard talking alone, but not as a child who invents imaginary friends. She gave orders as an experienced general. "No, not like this," he said, moving pebbles arranged in formation. "Horse ones go ahead to break the enemy lines, and we, the infantry, wait behind with the spears." Carmen peered out the window. Valeria was standing, hands on her waist, with an authority that did not match her age. "Francisco, take your musket and cover my left flank. And you, Joaquin, keep an eye so they don't surround us by the hill." The wooden spoon slipped from Carmen's hands. His daughter spoke of military tactics with specific names, organizing invisible troops like a battle commander. When Don Miguel arrived from work that night, smelling of oil and metal, his wife told her what she had witnessed. He, a practical man and used to solving concrete problems, was speechless. What was happening with Valeria went far beyond what her eyes could see. And they knew that from then on, nothing would be like before. The number of a retired professor at the University of Guanajuato, specialist in independence history. The man, Don Javier Marquez, was known in the neighborhood for his passionate lectures in the central square, where he recounts battles as if he had witnessed them. When Don Miguel called, explaining in a shaky voice what happened to Valeria, the historian was silent for a long moment. Then, with an urgency that surprised herself, he asked them to take the girl to his house that same afternoon. Don Javier's house smelled old books and newlywed coffee. The walls were covered with yellowish maps, portraits of heroes and a framed insurgent flag, the same as Valeria had described in dreams. Upon entering, the girl suddenly stopped, as if recognized the place. His eyes traveled the objects with a familiarity that froze in his parents' blood. "Here he is," he murmured, pointing to a rusty sword on the table. "Equal to La de Allende. There that uses Cuando Cabalgaba to my side." Don Javier, who had prepared meticulous questions to test the child's knowledge, felt the ground disappear under his feet. That was not the curiosity of an applied student. It was the voice of someone who was there. With hands that were shaking slightly, he opened a historic atlas and slid his finger over Dolores' route to Guanajuato. Dime, Valoria. What pasó cuando liga oyos afueras de la ciudad? The girl did not hesitate. He closed his eyes, as if revolving the scene, and started talking. El Father Hidalgo say to us that in the Habi he has a rest. Los Quechapines if habían atrinjarado en la alhóndiga, why la people del pueblo betrayed us piedras, palos, hasta que sin cuchillos. Yo stabs that loading the scales to climb the walls, his voice broke. Pero los canones. Los canones de hielos and was too fuertes. I saw care to muchos. Francisco, mi compañero de lo Aranco. She stopped, bringing her hands to her face as protected the eyes from an unbearable image. Don Javier exchanged a look with Carmen. Those details were not in any children's book. They were reports of surviving soldiers, archived in documents he had studied for decades. Why el nombre? Asked the historian, almost breathless. El nombre of you compare. Francisco. Valeria swallowed hard. Francisco Rojas. Murió abrazando la bandera cuando la second metralla discharge in the reach. The silence that followed was so dense that even the tick of the wall clock seemed to stop. Don Javier got up slowly, as if his legs did not support him. From a drawer, he removed a leather notebook and flipped into pages until he found what he was looking for. Here is, he said, showing a list of low. As in the siege of the Handy, handwritten by an insurgent chaplain. Francisco Rojas. Shallow soldier. Fallen el 28 of 1810 Septity. Carmen took her hands to her mouth. It was not possible. It could not be coincidence. Don Miguel, always the skeptic, felt a chill through his spine. Why es I no es en ella? Sign el nuestro? He murmured, as if talking to himself. Why if you would be worth remembering? Sign averting something? That idea hit them as a lightning. Because, after all, Guanajuato was not just the land of dead heroes. It was the land of struggles that still echoed. And if Valeria's memory weren't a ghost of the past, but a call from what was to come. Solo los más meticulous historians conocen. Y sin embargo, Alica Valeria, una niña of 6 años by transes disordered y matos stoted from tierra, describing military tactics with the official UN precision that hubiera estate en battle field. El profesor Ramirez sintió that el suelo moved bajo sus pies. It was not opposable that one had invented something as there. It was not opposable that, sin studies, sin acceso to secret archives, fila that el Cerro de San Miguel había was clave to cut out last from realistic troops. Why mucho less than mentioned in the exactly the strategic puppy algo that no appearance in the common text pounds. Why el pipola? Eduardo, probing Siberia with a lifting that would separate the fantasy of la memory viva. What do you needy de Cormavel? Valeria bajo la cabeza, as if he is the weight of that recovered la plastera. Sus fings trazaron lean in el polvo, debuting the enta figure bajo una lasa. It didn't want to live. Pero cuando violates we could not enter, that it was in the naked cañones flies against los canones, if it is the person, if I say, si en the pasillo, in the pasanadia. Luego tomo la lasa big I find in mina y if drag has a puerta. Los bullets las silbaban en los oida, pero el followed. Cuando lego, predio fuego con lo poco that left liniesca. El humo lo ahagoba, pero en the luz lasa hasta that los lamas lamier en la madera. Eduardo sintió that he has to escape from los pulmones. Esa version del pipola nola del haro invincible that cantaban in lodges. It was a hombre of meat y huso, con mito, con fe, with the active desperation that cambió el course of la batalla. It was exactly so that Ela Habia found in UN Diary Personal of UN Realist Solda captured, UN document that solo y of Massey's colleagues in all Mexica Habian Liid. Y después? Pria Cunto, augura y nu there. Después grito live la Virgen de Guadalupe. Y cayo valuaria cerro los ojos dash. Yo lo vi from el cerro. I saw fucking Puerta Abria, fucking naked in Entaban as wolves. Pero también 6 cuando una bala le through the el pecho. If quedo adi, con la lasa on en la ragda, like esi fura su cruz. The silence that siguió fue tan dense as the singing of los pajaros in el patio haber ends. Dona Carmen Santiguo. Don Miguel if he was a bro by el rostro, as he had intended to blur imagen that has just formed in his mind. Eduardo Ramirez, el hombre who dedicated to life to dig up oblivious truths, sintió that el suelo opened bajo él. Because it would be worth it telling the story. Set a recall. YSASA was a choir, Chains Francisco Alonso en the era soil and namra in a pushing archivo. It was a soldier that había muerto en sus brazos. UN compartment of weapons al that el, sin sabelo, había state seeking for decades in Maryland documents and discolored maps. Valeria? Voice del Professor Templo for the first time in años. 2. Is Francisco buried? La Nina lo miró with the ojos that does not belong to an infant. It was the ojos of someone who has seen the fuego de los canones, who had been meaningful el frío de la muerte rosendol el sol. Swimming in the burning, Corrigio. The medi y a los otros that caeran en el cerro. Pero Nadia busco después. Nadia in the record. Eduardo Ramirez I have a moment that they have just divided into the EL before YLL outs of considering the Valeria. Because if it is a 6 años lavaba within the spirit of the all-little soldier, shorts of the history of Mexico in the written solo and libos. Stab alive. Y lo lands la mando. El era en el archivo olea testigos of silence, the role that he had kept secrets for too long. When Eduardo's fingers touched that file almost undone for the time, he knew it was no accident. It was as if the pages had been waiting for him, as if Francisco Alonso himself, from somewhere between memory and eternity, would have guided him there. The realistic military report did not lie. The ink, although faded, still retained the poison of the war. The aforementioned insurgent was found among the rocks of the hill, having died from a mosquil wound in the chest. Eduardo felt that the ground moved under his feet. They were not just words in a document. It was the confirmation that a 6-year-old girl, with braids and glass voice, had described her own death with a precision that no historian could match. But fate did not settle for that. Among the dusty files, like a whisper of the past, the letter appeared. The paper creaked under his fingers as if he still kept the beat of the person who wrote it. Dear Mother Maria. Francisco Alonso's words jumped before his eyes, alive, painful, full of that love and that fear that only knows who knows that he is about to face his last dawn. If I die for Mexico. Eduardo had to rely on the table. It was not possible. It could not be possible. And yet there was the proof that Valeria not only remembered Francisco Alonso. Valeria was Francisco Alonso. The heart was beating with the strength of a war drum when he left the file. The son of Guanajuato fell to lead on cobbled streets, but he only felt a cold on his back, as if the spirit of that soldier accompanied him on the way back. I carried more than documents. He carried a truth that threatened to rewrite everything he thought he knew about history, memory, and human soul. The Herrera house smelled of fresh coffee and sweet bread when it arrived. Dona Carmen, the grandmother, received it with a look that betrayed weeks of nights. Did you find something, Professor? He asked, with that mixture of hope and fear that mothers only have when they intuit that the world of their children is about to change forever. Eduardo did not respond with words. In silence, the documents that had survived 2 centuries of oblivion extended on the wooden table. Francisco Alonso's letter, yellowish and fragile, shone in the afternoon light like a lighthouse in the fog. Valeria approached slowly. His eyes, which moments before playing with the innocence of childhood, suddenly darkened with something older, deeper. He extended a trembling hand and touched the paper. This is my lyrics, he whispered. The silence that followed was so dense that it seemed possible to cut it with a knife. Even the wall clock ticking sounded like a shot in the stillness of the room. Valeria? The voice of his mother broke the spell, loaded with a question that nobody dared to formulate aloud. The girl looked up. In his eyes there were no tears, but a terrifying clarity, as if the veil between the past and the present had been torn forever. Francisco did not want to be forgotten, he said, in a voice that was no longer quite his. That's why he came back. Here, between the walls discharged by time, Francisco Alonso had found not only a confessor, but a teacher. Valeria extended her hand towards the door as if she could feel the echo of those clandestine conversations, of the nights on which the priest told her of free Mexico while the wind dragged the smell of sail wax and wet land. He taught me that all Mexicans had fire in the chest, he whispered, and his voice resonated with a conviction that did not belong to a 6-year-old girl. That freedom is not a gift, it is a debt that we pay with blood when it is necessary. Dr. Mendoza held her breath. They were not words learned in history books, they were living truths, torn from a memory that challenged time. On the other side of the street, a group of students had stopped, with high telephones recording the moment. One of them, with a UDG shirt, murmured, "This is not theater. No one can pretend something like that." Valeria turned slowly, as if listening to music that only she could perceive. Her feet took her to the exact center of the square, where the cobblestone was more spent for centuries of footsteps. There he stopped, closed his eyes. And he raised his face towards the sky, as if the December sun could burn the shadows of 1810. "This was where I swore," he said, and his voice trembled not out of fear, but for the weight of an oath that still burned in his chest. "I swore that if I fell, my name would be Seed. That someone, at some point, would remember why it was worth dying." Professor Ramirez felt the air thickened. It wasn't just the girl who spoke, it was the land itself, that land that had drunk the blood of the insurgents and now would return it in the form of words. "Valeria," Dr. Mendoza intervened, with a voice thread that betrayed her shock, "how do you know this was Father Hidalgo's house?" "Historical records indicate that her residence was 2 blocks from here, in what is now the Museum of Independence." The girl opened her eyes and looked at him with a smile that was not his, he was tired smile of a man who had already seen too much. "Because he not only lived in that house, Doctor. He lived here," he said, pointing to the ground under his feet. "Here, where people knelt to receive their blessing before leaving. Here, where children like me took corn and beans because their parents didn't have to give it. The houses fall, the streets change their name, but the place where the heart of a town beats, that never moves." A silence fell on the square. Even birds seemed to stop their song. Dr. Mendoza lowered her notebook and, for the first time since she had arrived, she did not take notes. He simply watched the girl, no, the soldier, who was in front of her, with tight fists and bright eyes as if he still had a bayonet in his hand and a cry of war in his throat. Then, Valeria did something that froze the blood of everyone present. He put his hand to the chest, just where a 6-year-old heart should not remember the cold of a bullet, and said, "Here they hurt me. Not on the hill, as the papers say. Here, when I tried to protect a partner who could no longer run. But it doesn't matter where he fell, what matters is that I kept walking." And with those words, he turned and headed for the exit of the square, as if he knew that his mission there was over. Professor Ramirez ran to reach her, but Dona Carmen stopped him with a gesture. "Leave her," he murmured, with tears slipping down his cheeks. "She is not just my daughter. It is what remains of a man who still does not end her struggle." And at that moment, under the sky of Dolores Hidalgo, everyone understood that the history of Mexico was not written only in books. I was alive. I breathed. And sometimes, he came back to remind us that freedom is not a right, it is an open wound that never stops bleeding. We were not the same only in the blood, but in the fire that burned inside each of us. Francisco Alonso knew it. Therefore, when Dr. Mendoza confirmed that adobe house and spent beams had been a refuge for conspiracies, it was not the story written in the books that shuddered those present, but the echo of voices that still resonated between their walls. "Here more than a rebellion was forged," Valeria whispered, passing his fingers through the cracked wall. "An oath was forged here. But it was in the cemetery of Dolores Hidalgo where the past became meat." Between crooked crosses and tombstones devoured by the moss, Valeria advanced without hesitation, as if an invisible thread guided her. He stopped in front of a stone slab, so worn that the name was barely guessed, Maria Alonso. When kneeling, the dust of 2 centuries rose like a sigh. "My mother is buried here," he said, and the world seemed to stop. The words carved in the stone were a dagger. He died waiting for his son's return. Valeria broke into tears, not as a girl, but as a soldier who carries the defeat of a lost battle centuries ago. "She died without knowing that I never returned. He died believing that I abandoned her." Dona Carmen hugged her, but there was no comfort in her words, because some wounds do not heal over time, they are only learned to carry. Dr. Mendoza, accustomed to analyzing phenomena with clinical distance, felt the air thickened. Valeria not only remembered the places of Francisco Alonso, he lived them. He led the group by forgotten alleys, towards a hidden chapel where, according to the archives, Hidalgo had hidden weapons before shout. The tree pointed out under which, in 1810, a group of peasants. He swore to die rather than surrender. "How do you know this?" asked Professor Ramirez, but the answer was already in the girl's eyes. It was not knowledge, it was memory. The twilight dyed the sky of Dolores Hidalgo with the same tones that the insurgents had to see that early in September. The doctor approached Valeria, even on her knees, with the white knuckles of squeezing the earth on the grave. "Listen to me," he said with an urgency that he did not admit replica. "Francisco Alonso did not return by chance. He returned because Mexico still needed it. Not to fight, but to remind us that the country is not defended only with rifles, but with the truth that is passed from generation to generation." Valeria raised her head. The crying had washed his face, but in his gaze there was no despair, but a sharp clarity like the edge of a saber. "I know," he replied. "He can rest. I am his peace." He stood up and touched the tombstone for the last time, as if sealing a pact. "Thank you, Mama Maria. Your son fulfilled. Mexico is free." And then, as if the universe had expected that exact moment, the first stars pierced the sky. They were not simple points of light, they were witnesses. Because that night, in the cemetery of a town that smelled of wet land and living history, not just a girl said goodbye to a ghost. An entire country recovered a piece of his soul. The text continues with the transformation of Valeria and the legacy of Francisco Alonso, now intertwined with the future of Mexico. Francisco Alonso's physical traces vanished as the last sigh of a sunset in the Bajío, without stridencies, but leaving behind a dyed heaven of purpose. His signature was not in dusty documents or his face in yellowish portraits, because his legacy never was ink or pigment, but of fire. And the fire, when it burns with truth, does not go out, it spreads. Valeria no longer feels the weight of an alien memory in her chest, but she wears the certainty that the country is not a territory, but an oath. Every September, when the air smells like gunpowder and anticipated dead bread, she takes the stage of the school auditorium with a flag between the hands and a voice that does not tremble. He does not play a hero, it is the echo of all of them. The youngest students, who still confuse Hidalgo with Iturbide, are silent when she talks about the night Dolores shouted for the first time, when she explains that independence was not an act, but a painful birth that still does not end. The work that directs is not theater, it is a reminder that freedom is conquered every dawn. The plate in the library goes unnoticed by those who seek only to approve exams, but not for those who know how to read between the lines. To those who gave their lives for a free Mexico, their name can be forgotten, but our blood still waters our land, says the cold metal. Eduardo Ramirez, the professor who placed her there, never knew that her gesture would honor a ghost. But Valeria does know. And when he passes his fingers through the letters, he feels the same chill that toured his column that night in the Pantheon, the certainty that the fair causes never die, they only change hands. There are nights in Guanajuato where the wind descends from the mountains like a whisper of past centuries. Bring the sour perfume of the bougainvilleas, florists that grow better among ruins, and Valeria looks out to the window, barefoot, with tight fists on the chest. He does not remember the taste of the pulque that Francisco Alonso drank in the clandestine canteens or the rough touch of the rifles of the time, but feels the weight of his promise. Mexico is not a geographical accident, it is an open wound that bleeds hope, a cry that refuses to shut up. And she, without the need to remember it, knows that her mission is not to cry the past, but to end of the future. In the town, some murmur that the girl Herrera has something weird, as if the love of the homeland was a disease. But the elderly, which still keep in the scarred-stained ink of the first constitutions, look at it differently. They offer him pot of pot and tell him stories that are not in the books, how the priest Hidalgo blessed rifles with blessed water, how the women of Querétaro wove information among the hems of their enaguas, how freedom, just like corn, needs to be planted every season. Valeria listening, as in, and keep those seeds in the groove of their determination. Because Francisco Alonso did not die in 1810. The night Valeria Herrera died decided that his life would be a bridge between yesterday's sacrifice and tomorrow's justice. His soul does not vague between graves, beats in the chest of a young woman who today studies law at the University of Guanajuato, who discusses with passion the articles of the Constitution in the classrooms where he was previously conspired, which carries in the backpack a specimen of the Sarmiento Periquillo with margin annotations that are not his. The homeland does not defend himself with words, but with facts. He whispers a voice that is no longer alien, but proper. And it will always be. As long as there is a Mexican who refuses to bend his knee, as long as there is a voice that sings Mexicans to the cry of war with a swelling chest of genuine pride, while there are hands willing to build on foundations of honor, Francisco Alonso will live. Not as a spectrum, but as what was always an uncomfortable idea, a stubborn dream, a fire that is revived every time someone chooses to be free. Mexico is not a country. It is a pact. And Valeria Herrera, with his books, his plays, his nights in candle looking at the same stars that saw the insurgents go, is proof that some pacts are not signed with pen, but with the whole life. That this story does not end here. That it is repeated, to multiply, to find in you lector, dreamer, Mexican another heart willing to carry it forward. Because the souls of the heroes do not return to torment us, but to remind us that the homeland is not a gift, but a debt. And the debts of honor are paid with honor. Long live Mexico. Long live the memory that makes us free. Long live the fight that makes us human.